Good evening, my friend. Before we begin tonight's story, take a moment to get comfortable wherever you happen to be. Maybe you're listening from a quiet apartment while the city hums somewhere beyond the window. Maybe you're winding down after a long day. Or maybe, as often happens around here, you've found yourself awake at an hour that technically belongs to tomorrow. And if you're comfortable doing so, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there right now. Those little details always make these journeys feel a bit less lonely. And if you enjoy wandering through strange corners of history together, feel free to subscribe. No pressure. The stories will still be here either way. Tonight, we're going to spend some time with an event that sounds so impossible that many people assume it must be exaggerated. An explosion, a single explosion, one that reportedly killed tens of thousands of people, one that left bodies scattered across a city, one that was described by some witnesses in ways that seem almost impossible to believe. And perhaps strangest of all, one that gradually slipped into the shadows of history, becoming something halfway between a disaster and a rumor. The thing about history is that we often imagine it as a giant library. Every important event neatly placed on a shelf, every catastrophe labelled, every mystery eventually solved. But history is much closer to an old attic. Things get misplaced, things fall behind furniture, entire stories disappear beneath piles of newer stories. And every once in a while, someone opens a dusty box and discovers something that makes them stop and ask a very uncomfortable question. How did I never hear about this? The event we're exploring tonight lives in that uncomfortable space. Not forgotten exactly, not remembered either, just sitting quietly in the dark, waiting. The first thing to understand is that humans have a remarkable talent for believing disasters only happen to other people. This has always been true. It was true 500 years ago. It was true 50 years ago. It was true yesterday. A person wakes up, gets dressed, eats breakfast, complains about work, worries about money, thinks about errands, makes plans for tomorrow. The possibility that tomorrow might never arrive usually doesn't enter the conversation. And honestly, that's probably for the best. Imagine trying to enjoy breakfast while calculating the odds of every possible catastrophe. You would spend 20 minutes deciding whether toast is worth the risk. Human beings survive partly because we are very good at ignoring terrifying possibilities. Most of the time, this works beautifully. Sometimes, it doesn't. The city at the center of our story was filled with ordinary people, shopkeepers, laborers, children, government officials, servants, merchants, people who had arguments to finish, bills to pay, meals to cook, roofs to repair. People whose lives felt completely normal, because normal is usually invisible while you're living inside it. Nobody wakes up in the morning thinking they are currently standing inside a future mystery. That realization only arrives later, often much later, and when it does arrive, it usually arrives for someone else. A historian, an archivist, a curious reader, a person sitting awake in bed listening to a story hundreds of years after everyone involved has disappeared. One of the strange things about disasters is how ordinary the hours before them often seem. There is rarely dramatic music. No narrator appears from the sky. No helpful warning label floats above a city. The world simply continues being itself. Dogs bark, doors open, people complain about weather, someone misplaces a shoe. Someone burns breakfast. Someone decides to postpone an important conversation until tomorrow. History is full of people who expected tomorrow. That might be one of the saddest recurring themes in the entire human story. The expectation of tomorrow. A surprisingly fragile thing. Now, when most people think about explosions, they imagine fire. They imagine noise. They imagine destruction. And they're not wrong. But explosions are stranger than that. An explosion is really a moment when the world decides to move too fast. Air moves too fast. Pressure moves too fast. Objects move too fast. Information moves too fast. The human body, unfortunately, was not designed for any of this. And because our brains struggle to understand events that happen almost instantly, we tend to simplify them afterward. We imagine one giant boom, one giant flash, one giant moment. But reality is usually much messier. The first people affected by a catastrophic explosion often don't understand what is happening. Not because they're foolish, because the event itself exceeds normal experience. Imagine hearing a sound so loud that your brain can't immediately identify it. Imagine feeling the ground move. Imagine seeing dust where there should be sky. Imagine suddenly realizing that every person around you looks just as confused as you feel. Confusion is one of the most overlooked parts of disaster. Movies skip over it. History books compress it. Human memory often edits it out. But confusion is everywhere. What was that? Where did it come from? Is it over? Should I run? Run where? Those questions can last only seconds. But sometimes seconds are enough, especially when thousands of lives are balanced on them. The event we're investigating tonight produced exactly that kind of confusion. In fact, one reason it remains mysterious is because people couldn't agree on what had happened even while it was happening. Some believed it was an explosion. Others thought it was an earthquake. Others thought it was a storm. Some believed supernatural forces were involved. And before we laugh at them, it's worth remembering that human beings still do exactly the same thing today. Give people a confusing event and they will generate explanations almost immediately. Some reasonable, some ridiculous, some surprisingly creative. The need for explanation often arrives before the explanation itself. Nobody likes uncertainty. We would rather have a bad answer than no answer. History repeatedly demonstrates this uncomfortable truth, and disasters provide perfect conditions for bad answers. Fear speeds everything up. Rumors spread faster than facts. People repeat things they heard from someone who heard them from someone else. By the end of the day, one strange event has already become 5 different stories. By the end of the week, it has become 10. By the end of a century, nobody is entirely sure which pieces belong to the original puzzle. This is how mysteries are born, not necessarily from secrecy, sometimes from abundance. Too many stories, too many witnesses, too many interpretations. Imagine trying to reconstruct a dream after thousands of people have each added their own details. Eventually, the dream becomes larger than reality, and yet reality remains hidden somewhere inside it. That hidden reality is what makes this particular story so fascinating, because at its center sits a detail that refuses to disappear. A detail so strange that people keep returning to it generation after generation. Not the explosion itself, not the death toll, not the destruction, the clothing, or, more specifically, the absence of clothing. It's an unsettling detail, one of those details that lodges itself in the mind. You hear it once, and suddenly every other piece of information begins orbiting around it. How could an explosion remove clothing? Could it really happen? Was it exaggerated? Was it misunderstood? Did later storytellers make it larger than reality? Or was there something about this catastrophe that genuinely defied ordinary expectations? Questions like these linger, and lingering questions are often more powerful than answers. Answers allow us to move on. Questions invite us to stay. So for the next little while, we're going to stay. We're going to slow down. We're going to step carefully into a world that no longer exists. A world without emergency broadcasts, without television, without social media, without photographs. A world where information travelled at the speed of people. A world where rumours sometimes outran horses. A world where a catastrophe could happen in the morning and still feel unreal by sunset. And as we move deeper into this story, something curious begins to happen. The explosion itself starts to feel less mysterious, not less terrifying, just more human. Because beneath every disaster are ordinary people trying to understand extraordinary circumstances, trying to explain things they have never seen before, trying to make sense of a world that suddenly feels unfamiliar. And that effort, strangely enough, may be the most important clue of all, because sometimes the mystery isn't what happened. Sometimes the mystery is how people remembered it afterward, and those two things are not always the same. In fact, they're often very different. The explosion lasted only moments. The confusion lasted centuries. And in many ways, we're still standing inside it. If you had walked through the city that morning, you would have noticed absolutely nothing unusual. And that, strangely enough, is one of the most unsettling details in the entire story. Disasters are much easier to understand when they announce themselves. Storm clouds gathering on the horizon, smoke rising in the distance, the smell of something burning, a crowd running in one direction. Those things feel fair. Not pleasant, perhaps, but fair. The world gives a warning. The world clears its throat. The world says, in its own way, that something is coming. But this morning offered no such courtesy. The city woke exactly as it had woken countless times before. Before sunrise, there were already people moving through the streets. Cities never truly sleep. Even centuries ago, there is always someone awake. Someone working, someone worrying, someone carrying something heavy, someone regretting a decision made the previous evening. A baker might already have been preparing dough in the darkness. A servant might have been drawing water from a well. A merchant might have been calculating debts that seemed very important at the time. And to be fair, they probably were important. One of history's little jokes is that even on the day of a catastrophe, people still have errands. The roof still leaks. The customer still owes money. The child still refuses to put on shoes. The neighbour is still annoying. Life remains stubbornly ordinary right up until the moment it isn't. The air that morning would have carried familiar smells. Cooking fires, wood smoke, animals, food, dust. The complicated scent that forms whenever thousands of human beings live close together. Modern people sometimes imagine the past as cleaner than it was, or dirtier than it was. Usually both at the same time. The truth sits somewhere in the middle. Cities have always possessed their own atmosphere, their own smell, their own sound. Every street develops a personality. Every neighborhood acquires habits. Every market creates a rhythm, and those rhythms become invisible to the people living inside them. You stop noticing what remains constant. That is true whether you live in a modern apartment building or a 17th century city. Human beings adapt remarkably quickly. The smell you hated when you arrived becomes the smell you no longer notice. The noise that kept you awake becomes silence. The chaos becomes routine. And routine is one of the most powerful forces in human life. It is stronger than logic, stronger than memory, sometimes stronger than danger. Most people spend their lives moving through routines they barely recognize. Wake up, work, eat, sleep, repeat. There is comfort in repetition. There is also risk, because routine teaches us that tomorrow will resemble today. And most of the time, it does. Most mornings are not historical events. Most mornings never appear in books. Most mornings vanish forever. This particular morning would have vanished too, if not for what followed. That thought alone feels strangely haunting. Thousands of people were living what they assumed would be an ordinary day. None of them knew they were currently participating in the final normal hours of their lives. A phrase that sounds dramatic until you realize it applies to everyone eventually. Somewhere in the city, someone was making plans for next week. Somewhere else, someone was worrying about a minor embarrassment. Someone was probably convinced they were having the worst day of their life. History has a dark sense of humor when it comes to those moments. The worst day of your life often arrives without introducing itself. It simply waits, patiently. At this point, it is worth slowing down and thinking about what a large city actually feels like before modern technology. Not what it looks like, what it feels like. There are no engines, no traffic lights, no electronic hum, no distant airplanes crossing the sky. The loudest sounds come from people, animals, tools, wheels, voices, wind. The city breathes differently. Noise arrives in waves. A market grows louder as morning progresses. Footsteps multiply. Conversations overlap. Merchants call out prices. Children shout. Dogs object to something. Dogs are often objecting to something. Nobody has quite figured out what. Perhaps dogs simply understand history better than the rest of us. Perhaps they spend their lives warning us about things we are too distracted to notice. Or perhaps they just enjoy barking. Either explanation feels plausible. As sunlight climbed higher, the city became increasingly alive. Doors opened, courtyards filled, workers moved toward jobs. Officials prepared for another day of paperwork, an activity that has survived every civilization with astonishing determination. Empires rise, empires fall. Someone continues filling out forms. It may be humanity's most durable tradition. Even in an age of armies, palaces, and dynasties, there were documents waiting to be signed, reports waiting to be delivered, complaints waiting to be ignored. Somewhere, an official probably believed his paperwork mattered more than anything else happening in the city. A reasonable assumption, at least until it wasn't. Near the Armory district, daily life followed its own familiar pattern. Storage facilities, workers, supplies, movement, the kind of activity that becomes invisible through repetition. People tend not to fear familiar things. This is one reason accidents happen. Danger becomes furniture, something permanently present and therefore rarely examined. A worker who passes the same building every day stops seeing it. A sailor stops fearing the ocean. A miner stops fearing the darkness. A soldier stops fearing weapons. Not because the danger disappears, because familiarity disguises it. This might be one of the most dangerous human abilities, our capacity to normalize almost anything. A strange smell becomes normal. A strange noise becomes normal. A structural crack becomes normal. A risky procedure becomes normal. The phrase, "we've always done it this way," has probably caused more trouble than most villains. And unlike villains, it rarely receives blame. Imagine generations of people working around explosive materials. Imagine years passing without catastrophe, then decades, perhaps longer. Each safe day reinforces confidence. Each ordinary morning becomes evidence that tomorrow will also be ordinary. Humans are excellent statisticians when the statistics support comfort, less excellent when they do not. At some point that morning, people were undoubtedly standing very close to forces capable of killing them instantly. They simply didn't know it. Or perhaps they knew in the abstract way. People often know uncomfortable truths. The way modern drivers know accidents happen, the way people know lightning exists, the way everyone knows life is fragile while behaving as though it isn't. Knowledge is not the same thing as belief. You can know something for years without truly believing it. Then reality arrives, and suddenly belief catches up. But not yet. Not this morning. The city remained suspended in normality. A remarkable state when you think about it. Normality is really just a collective agreement. Millions of tiny expectations functioning simultaneously. The roof will stay where it is. The street will remain beneath our feet. The sky will behave like a sky. The walls will continue being walls. The future will arrive in the correct order. We almost never question these assumptions. Doing so would be exhausting. Yet every catastrophe begins with one assumption failing. then another, then another, until people find themselves standing in a world they no longer recognize. If there was one thing unusual about that morning, it existed only in hindsight. The city was unknowingly approaching a dividing line, an invisible boundary. On one side stood ordinary life. On the other stood confusion, destruction, rumor, grief, and centuries of speculation. Nobody could see the line. Nobody stepped around it. Nobody hesitated. The baker crossed it. The merchant crossed it. The child crossed it. The servant crossed it. The official crossed it. The labourer crossed it. The entire city crossed it together without noticing. That is often how history works, not through dramatic entrances, through invisible thresholds. One moment the world is familiar. The next moment, people spend generations trying to explain what happened. And somewhere, amid the sounds of carts, footsteps, conversations, and morning routines, the city continued moving toward a moment that would last only seconds. A moment so brief that many victims would never understand it. A moment so powerful that centuries later, people would still argue about what they had seen. A moment that would eventually become tangled in rumor, politics, memory, fear, and imagination. But for now, the city still belonged to the living. The markets remained open. The conversations continued. The paperwork survived. The future still appeared reliable. And perhaps that is what makes the coming disaster feel so unsettling. Not its violence, not its mystery, but its timing, because catastrophe rarely arrives when people are ready. It arrives when people are busy doing something completely ordinary. And at this exact moment, thousands of ordinary lives were moving quietly toward an extraordinary end. None of them knew it, and perhaps that ignorance was the last peaceful thing they would ever experience. There is a peculiar moment that appears again and again in accounts of disasters, a moment that rarely makes its way into paintings, or monuments, or history books, a moment so brief that it often survives only in fragments. It is the moment before people understand, not before something happens. Before they understand that it is happening. Those are not the same thing. The city had already crossed its invisible boundary. Nobody knew that, of course. The baker still had dough to shape. The merchant still had prices to negotiate. Someone was probably in the middle of a completely unnecessary argument. Human beings are surprisingly committed to unnecessary arguments. Empires collapse. Volcanoes erupt. Mysterious explosions reshape cities. And somewhere, someone is still insisting they are technically correct. History offers overwhelming evidence that this is one of our defining traits. The morning continued. The sun climbed. The streets filled. The rhythm of ordinary life carried on. Then something changed. Not enough to trigger panic. Not enough to make people run. Just enough to feel wrong. And sometimes wrong is much harder to recognize than danger. Danger announces itself. Wrong whispers. One of the difficulties with reconstructing ancient disasters is that human memory does not record events like a camera. People remember feelings, sounds, fragments, sensations, a sudden silence, an unusual vibration, a strange pressure in the air. The brain notices these things before it understands them. Imagine sitting in your home. Everything appears normal. Then, for reasons you cannot identify, something feels different. Perhaps a distant sound, perhaps a vibration beneath your feet, perhaps the faintest suggestion that the world is no longer behaving exactly as it did a moment ago. Most people ignore such things. We ignore hundreds of unusual sensations every day. Otherwise, we would never accomplish anything. Every creak would require investigation. Every noise would demand analysis. Every shadow would become a crisis. Life depends upon selective attention. Unfortunately, selective attention occasionally ignores something important. Perhaps an animal reacted first. Animals often receive starring roles in disaster stories, sometimes deservedly, sometimes not, but people have always noticed that animals occasionally behave strangely before catastrophic events. Dogs become restless. Birds scatter unexpectedly. Horses refuse to move. Livestock grow agitated. Whether these reactions represent genuine awareness or simply human hindsight remains difficult to prove, but the stories persist. And perhaps that is enough. Imagine a dog suddenly staring towards some distant part of the city, not barking, not running, simply staring, as though listening to something no human has noticed yet. Then imagine the dog eventually losing interest, because dogs, like the rest of us, are not historians. Whatever warning existed was either too subtle or too brief. Life continued, yet somewhere nearby, forces were already in motion. One of the uncomfortable realities of explosions is that they often begin long before the explosion itself. A spark begins somewhere unseen. A reaction starts. Pressure accumulates. Materials shift. Energy waits. An explosion is not really a beginning. It is an ending, the visible conclusion of an invisible process. By the time people hear the sound, most of the important decisions have already been made. Not by individuals, by physics. And physics is notoriously difficult to negotiate with. You cannot persuade pressure. You cannot compromise with fire. You cannot ask stored energy to remain patient. Eventually, it demands release. And when that release comes, it does not care who happens to be nearby. The city remained unaware, or mostly unaware. Perhaps a worker noticed something unusual. Perhaps not. One of the most haunting questions in disaster history is whether anyone recognized the danger in time. Somebody often does. Somebody notices the smell, the smoke, the crack, the leak, the heat, the vibration. The problem is that recognition and response are different things. You can recognize danger and still underestimate it. People do this constantly. A little smoke, a small crack, a strange noise. Nothing urgent, nothing immediate, nothing worth alarming everyone. Then suddenly it is. Human beings are remarkably good at explaining away warning signs, a useful ability most days, a catastrophic ability on rare ones. Perhaps somewhere in the city a person paused briefly, looked up, frowned, listened, then returned to whatever they had been doing. That possibility feels strangely sad, not because it changes the outcome, because it feels familiar. We have all done it. Ignored a warning, dismissed a concern, promised ourselves we would check later. Later is one of the most dangerous words in human history. Entire disasters have hidden inside it. The atmosphere itself may have begun changing, not visibly, not dramatically, but enough that witnesses later struggled to describe it. Many catastrophe accounts contain phrases that sound frustratingly vague. The air felt strange. The sky looked odd. Something seemed wrong. Modern readers often find these descriptions unsatisfying. We want measurements, numbers, precise explanations. But people experiencing extraordinary events rarely speak in precise explanations. They speak in feelings. The air felt heavy. The world felt quiet. The morning felt different. And because language struggles to capture uncertainty, such descriptions often sound mystical when they are merely human. The city continued moving. People crossed streets, opened doors, carried baskets, filled cups, counted coins, argued over prices, swept floors, fed animals, performed countless tiny actions that history never records. And then, without warning, the ordinary world ended. Not gradually, not politely, not in stages. Instantly, the sound arrived, or perhaps the pressure arrived first. Witnesses in catastrophic events often disagree about this. The body experiences both so quickly that memory struggles to separate them. A roar, a crack, a thunderous detonation, a force so immense that language immediately begins failing because every comparison sounds inadequate. Like thunder, but not thunder. Like an earthquake, but not an earthquake. Like the sky splitting apart. Like the earth breaking open. Like mountains colliding. People reach for familiar images because there are no familiar images. The sound did not simply enter the city. For many people, it became the city. It filled everything. The ears, the chest, the ground, the air, the mind. One moment there were conversations. The next, there was only noise. And then, for some people, not even that. One of the cruelest features of extremely powerful explosions is how little time they allow for fear. Fear usually requires awareness. Awareness requires time. Many victims never receive enough of either. The event arrives before understanding, before decision, before reaction. The world changes faster than thought. For those farther away, however, something even stranger happened. They survived long enough to witness confusion. Windows shattered, walls shook, roofs moved, dust exploded upward, birds erupted into the sky, people froze. The human brain has an interesting response to impossible events. It pauses, not for long, sometimes only seconds, but long enough. People look around, waiting for someone else to explain, waiting for authority, waiting for certainty, waiting for instructions. Nobody has any. Nobody understands. And so thousands of minds begin searching simultaneously for explanations. Earthquake, attack, storm, fire, heavenly warning, enemy action, accident, anything, something. The need for explanation arrives instantly. The explanation itself arrives much later, sometimes centuries later. Perhaps the strangest thing about a massive explosion is that the explosion itself is only the first disaster. The second disaster is confusion. People cannot find family members, cannot locate streets, cannot recognize landmarks, cannot determine where safety exists. The map inside their heads stops matching reality. A person turns a corner, expecting a familiar building. The building is gone. A person runs toward home. The route no longer exists. A person searches for loved ones. Everyone is searching. No one knows where to begin. But those moments come slightly later. At first, there is only the sound, the impossible sound, the sound nobody understood, the sound that would continue echoing through witness accounts long after the physical noise had vanished, because sounds disappear quickly. Questions do not. And even now, centuries later, we are still listening to that echo, still trying to determine what happened in the instant between an ordinary morning and an extraordinary catastrophe, still standing with those bewildered survivors as dust rises into the sky, still waiting for the world to explain itself. And the world, as usual, remains frustratingly silent. When air becomes a weapon, one of the strange limitations of language is that it encourages us to think of explosions as objects. Something happens. There is a blast. Then it is over. A beginning, a middle, an end. Neat, understandable, contained. Reality is far less polite, because an explosion is not really an object at all. It is movement, violent movement, movement occurring so quickly that the human mind struggles to imagine it. And perhaps the most important thing moving is not fire, not debris, not even buildings. It is air, ordinary air, the same invisible thing filling your room right now, the same thing entering your lungs without permission and leaving again a few seconds later. The same thing so familiar that most people rarely think about it at all, until it becomes a weapon. The city did not experience a giant wall of fire, not at first. The city experienced air behaving in a way air was never supposed to behave. Pressure, velocity, force, the sudden release of unimaginable energy. For centuries, people tried to describe what they had witnessed. Many failed, not because they lacked intelligence, because certain experiences exceed ordinary vocabulary. Imagine describing a hurricane to someone who has never felt wind. Imagine describing an ocean to someone who has never seen water. Imagine describing a blast powerful enough to rearrange an entire district in seconds. Eventually, language begins to creak under the weight. Witnesses reach for comparisons. Thunder, earthquakes, heaven, dragons, divine anger, anything capable of carrying part of the truth, but only part. Because what actually happened was both simpler and stranger. The air moved, and everything else moved with it. Doors, tiles, wood, stone, glass, dust, animals, people, entire sections of ordinary life suddenly became projectiles. A moment earlier, a roof had simply been a roof. Now it was moving. A cartwheel had been part of a cart. Now it was flying. A wooden beam had been supporting a building. Now it was crossing a street. The world stopped respecting categories. Nothing remained where it belonged. One of the unsettling realities of catastrophic events is how quickly civilization disappears. We tend to imagine civilization as something solid, permanent, reliable. A city feels durable. Buildings feel durable. Roads feel durable. Yet much of civilization is simply an agreement that things will stay where they are. A house remains a house because its pieces remain assembled. A street remains a street because the buildings around it remain standing. Remove those assumptions and the transformation happens almost instantly. A city becomes rubble with remarkable efficiency. The survivors who remained conscious would have experienced something difficult for modern people to imagine, not because modern disasters do not occur, because modern people usually encounter them through video. Video creates distance. A screen places a thin layer of safety between observer and event. The people in the city possessed no such protection. The disaster was not something they watched. It was something they occupied, something they breathed, something that wrapped itself around them. Dust surged through streets. Darkness appeared where sunlight had existed moments before. Visibility collapsed. The familiar city vanished. And when familiar things vanish unexpectedly, the human brain becomes surprisingly childlike. People search for landmarks, for orientation, for certainty, a doorway, a wall, a recognizable street, anything, but often those things were gone or altered beyond recognition. One moment, a person knew exactly where they stood. The next moment, they no longer recognized the world around them. That loss of orientation deserves more attention than it usually receives. Because being lost inside your own neighborhood is deeply unsettling. Being lost inside a destroyed city is something else entirely. The body understands before the mind does. Heart racing, breathing hard, eyes searching, adrenaline flooding through systems designed for immediate survival. Thousands of years of evolution suddenly activated. Run, hide, move, find safety. The difficulty, of course, was that nobody knew where safety was. The explosion had erased the map. And then came another problem, a quieter one, a stranger one, the problem that would eventually survive for centuries. The clothing. At first, the reports sound impossible. Bodies found without clothing, garments missing, victims partially stripped, people discovering articles of clothing far from their owners. Modern readers encounter these descriptions and immediately imagine something supernatural, which is understandable. The detail feels wrong, almost theatrical, as though it belongs in folklore rather than history. But catastrophic events often create evidence that appears supernatural until examined closely. Human beings have always underestimated the power of moving air. Perhaps because we cannot see it. Fire announces itself. Water announces itself. A falling rock announces itself rather dramatically. Air remains invisible, even when it becomes deadly, especially when it becomes deadly. A powerful blast wave can interact with clothing in surprisingly chaotic ways. Loose fabric, belts, robes, outer garments, hats, shoes, anything not firmly attached suddenly becomes vulnerable. And in a city where clothing was often layered, wrapped, tied, folded, and secured differently than modern garments, the effects could become even stranger. Yet the physical explanation is only part of the story. Because disasters continue long after physics finishes its work, imagine the aftermath. Dust everywhere, buildings collapsed, bodies moved by rescue efforts, families searching desperately for loved ones, possessions scattered across entire districts, animals running loose, structures continuing to fall, people carrying the injured, people carrying the dead, people carrying anything they could salvage. In such chaos, clothing becomes separated from people for countless reasons. A sleeve catches on debris, a robe tears, a shoe disappears, a rescuer removes damaged garments. Someone drags a body, someone covers another, someone uncovers another. Hours pass. Stories begin forming, and then something fascinating happens. The physical reality starts transforming into social reality. A few unusual observations become widely repeated. Those repetitions become memory. Memory becomes narrative. Narrative becomes history. History becomes mystery. This process occurs so gradually that nobody notices it. The explosion throws objects. The survivors throw stories. Both travel farther than expected. Meanwhile, the city itself continued suffering, because the blast was only the first wave. Now came collapse, dust inhalation, injuries, missing relatives, panic, the quieter forms of disaster. The forms that receive less attention because they lack dramatic visuals: a broken leg beneath rubble, a child unable to find home, an elderly person wandering through unfamiliar streets, a family searching names that no longer have bodies attached to them. These experiences rarely appear in official records, yet they define catastrophe far more than the moment of impact. History loves explosions. Humans endure aftermaths, and aftermaths are often slow: hours, days, weeks, sometimes years. A person survives the blast only to die later from injuries. A family survives physically but loses everything else. A neighborhood survives structurally but never feels the same again. Disasters have long shadows. The shadows often matter more than the event itself, yet the human mind remains attracted to the instant. The boom, the flash, the mystery, the impossible image. 20,000 people, missing clothing, bodies scattered across a city. These details command attention, and perhaps that is why they survived. Not necessarily because they were the most important details, because they were the most unforgettable. There is a difference. History often preserves what is memorable rather than what is representative. One strange image can outlive 10,000 ordinary truths. A survivor might spend years mourning family members, yet later generations remember only the story about missing clothes. Not because later generations are cruel, because human memory behaves strangely. It collects symbols, and symbols travel well. The missing garments became a symbol of disorder, of vulnerability, of a world suddenly stripped of dignity and certainty. Clothing, after all, is not merely fabric. It is identity, occupation, status, privacy, belonging. When people described bodies without clothing, they were not merely describing physical conditions. They were describing a collapse of order itself. A city where normal rules no longer applied. A city where familiar boundaries had disappeared. A city where even the dead seemed displaced. And perhaps that is why the detail endured, because it captured something larger than itself, not just what happened to bodies, what happened to meaning. For a few terrible moments, everything that usually made sense stopped making sense. Air became a weapon. Buildings became missiles. Streets became ruins. Rumors became evidence. And ordinary people became participants in a mystery that would survive long after their names had been forgotten. The explosion lasted seconds. The questions it created would last centuries. And as the dust slowly settled across the wounded city, another problem was already beginning to emerge. A problem no explosion can solve. No government can solve. No historian can fully solve. A problem as old as civilization itself. How do you count the dead when there are simply too many of them? One of the strangest things about large disasters is that the bigger they become, the less precise they often are. That sounds backwards. Most people assume that a catastrophe involving thousands of people should produce thousands of records, thousands of names, thousands of confirmations, thousands of neatly organized facts. Instead, the opposite frequently happens. The larger the disaster, the more difficult it becomes to understand. The more lives affected, the fewer certainties survive. And nowhere is that more apparent than in the simple question everyone eventually asks. How many people died? It sounds like an easy question, a reasonable question, perhaps even the first question. But history has a habit of turning reasonable questions into impossible ones. Imagine standing inside the city after the explosion, not centuries later, not as a historian, not as a curious listener relaxing in bed, as an actual survivor, dust still hanging in the air, buildings damaged, people screaming names, families searching, animals wandering, entire streets transformed into landscapes no longer recognizable. Now imagine somebody approaching you and asking for an exact death count. You would probably stare at them, not because the question is foolish, because it is absurdly early. The dead have not even finished dying yet. The injured are still becoming casualties. The missing have not yet been found. The trapped have not yet been rescued. The city itself has not yet understood what happened. Yet, almost immediately, people begin counting, or trying to. Humans count things. We count because counting creates the illusion of control. A disaster with a number feels more manageable than a disaster without one. A city can survive uncertainty. The human mind struggles much more. And so the counting begins. Someone counts bodies. Someone counts households. Someone counts buildings. Someone counts reports. Someone counts rumors. Someone counts missing relatives. Someone counts funerals. Someone counts survivors. And before long, all those different numbers begin colliding with one another. The result is rarely clarity. The result is often confusion wearing the costume of certainty. Consider a simple problem. A family of 5 disappears. Nobody can find them. Are they dead? Perhaps. Perhaps not. Maybe they fled. Maybe they are trapped. Maybe they are injured in another district. Maybe they are sheltering somewhere. Maybe they are buried beneath rubble. At what point do they become part of the death toll? An hour later? A day later? A week later? History rarely provides clear instructions. Disasters create thousands of questions like this simultaneously, and every answer changes the final number. The city at the center of our story faced exactly this problem. Reports eventually emerged claiming that approximately 20,000 people had died. 20,000, a number large enough to feel almost abstract. Most people cannot genuinely imagine 20,000 individuals. The human brain isn't particularly good at large numbers. It pretends to be, but it isn't. Tell someone that 20,000 people died, and the mind immediately begins compressing. The number becomes a symbol, a concept, a headline, not 20,000 separate lives, 20,000 breakfasts interrupted, 20,000 unfinished conversations, 20,000 collections of habits, fears, memories, and plans. Numbers protect us from scale, which is useful because the alternative would be overwhelming. Yet numbers also hide scale, which is dangerous because the alternative is truth. Somewhere in the aftermath, officials attempted to understand what remained, an impossible task. Buildings could be counted, at least in theory. Walls either stood or they didn't. Roofs either survived or they didn't. But people are not buildings. People move. People vanish. People leave. People return. People are reported missing. Then found. Then reported missing again. One of the uncomfortable realities of historical disasters is that many victims simply disappear from the record. Not because anyone intended deception, because record keeping has limits, especially during chaos. Imagine searching for relatives in a city that no longer resembles itself. Imagine trying to identify bodies. Imagine trying to determine who lived in which home after the home no longer exists. Imagine attempting this without modern identification systems, without photographs, without databases, without computers, without even reliable communication between districts. The challenge quickly becomes enormous. And then comes another complication. The living are surprisingly disruptive to counting. A person presumed dead appears unexpectedly. Someone believed alive is discovered later. Someone reported twice becomes 2 casualties instead of 1. Someone else is never reported at all. The numbers shift continuously, like sand. Yet governments dislike shifting numbers. Governments prefer certainty. Citizens prefer certainty. Historians prefer certainty. Newspapers would eventually prefer certainty. Everyone prefers certainty. Reality rarely cooperates. So eventually, a number emerges. Not because it is perfect, because it is useful. Useful numbers survive. Perfect numbers almost never exist. This may explain why large historical death tolls often feel strangely round. 5,000, 10,000, 20,000, 50,000. Numbers that sound complete. Numbers that feel finished, as though suffering politely stopped at a convenient mathematical boundary. Reality almost never behaves this way. Reality is untidy. Reality produces awkward numbers, yet awkward numbers rarely survive centuries. Round numbers travel better. They fit inside memory. They fit inside stories. They fit inside history. And once a number becomes attached to an event, removing it becomes surprisingly difficult, even if nobody is entirely certain where it came from. Imagine an official receiving reports from different parts of the city. 300 dead here, 1,000 there, several hundred missing elsewhere. Entire neighborhoods impossible to assess. How should that information become a final number? The answer is simple. It shouldn't, not immediately. But humans dislike unfinished questions. So unfinished questions receive finished answers. Again and again, throughout history, the result is a curious phenomenon. People often remember the death toll more clearly than the event itself. Ask someone about a famous disaster, and they may not remember the cause. They may not remember the location. They may not remember the year. But they remember the number. Because numbers create certainty, or at least the appearance of it. The explosion becomes 20,000 deaths. The complexity disappears. The uncertainty disappears. The individual lives disappear. Only the number remains. There is another reason casualty figures become distorted. Politics. Politics arrives remarkably quickly after catastrophe. Sometimes, before the dust settles, an official might benefit from emphasizing the scale. Another might benefit from minimizing it. A ruler may wish to demonstrate compassion. A rival may wish to demonstrate incompetence. Religious leaders may see divine warnings. Military leaders may see sabotage. Everyone views the disaster through a slightly different lens, and every lens changes the count, not always intentionally, often unconsciously. People see what supports the story they already believe. This tendency appears so consistently throughout history that it may as well be a law of nature, not a flattering law, but a reliable one. Meanwhile, survivors continue searching, and this is perhaps the saddest part. While officials debate numbers, families search for names. A government wants totals. A mother wants one child. A husband wants one wife. A friend wants one friend. The scale of the disaster means nothing to them. The only number that matters is one. One missing person. One missing voice. One missing face. One missing future. Multiply that experience thousands of times, and you begin approaching the reality hidden beneath a statistic. Not the full reality, only the edge of it. The full reality is too large, too personal, too fragmented. No archive can fully preserve it. No historian can fully reconstruct it. And perhaps that is why large disasters feel haunted. Not because ghosts remain, because absences remain, unanswered questions remain, names disappear, stories disappear. Entire lives shrink into a single line in a document, or vanish completely. The explosion left rubble, but it also left uncertainty, and uncertainty has remarkable staying power. Centuries later, people still debate the number. Was it truly 20,000? More? Less? Nobody knows. Nobody can know. The city lost not only lives, it lost information, and information, once destroyed, can be surprisingly difficult to recover. This is one reason the mystery survived. The explosion damaged more than buildings. It damaged certainty itself, and whenever certainty disappears, imagination begins moving into the empty space. People create explanations, stories, theories, rumors, possibilities, some sensible, some ridiculous, some persuasive enough to survive generations. Because human beings dislike blank spaces. If history leaves a question unanswered, somebody will eventually answer it. Whether the answer is correct is another matter entirely, and as the years passed, the explosion became something more than a catastrophe. It became a story, then a mystery, then a legend, and like all legends, it began attracting explanations. Some grounded in reality, some wandering far beyond it. Because once people hear about 20,000 dead, missing clothing, and an event nobody fully understands, the imagination starts working overtime. And imagination, unlike evidence, has no limit. One of the most reliable patterns in human history is that whenever something truly extraordinary happens, explanations arrive almost immediately. Not good explanations, not accurate explanations, just explanations. Human beings are remarkably uncomfortable around unanswered questions. We can tolerate pain. We can tolerate uncertainty about the future. We can even tolerate danger for surprisingly long periods of time. But we struggle with mysteries, especially large ones, especially mysteries that arrive without warning and leave devastation behind. A mystery feels unfinished. And the human mind has a powerful urge to finish things, to connect dots, to build patterns, to create stories. Sometimes those stories are true, sometimes they are not, and sometimes they become more famous than the event that inspired them. The explosion at the center of our story produced exactly that kind of environment. A city damaged, thousands dead, countless injured, buildings destroyed. Reports that sounded unbelievable, And perhaps most importantly, no explanation that satisfied everyone. That final detail matters more than it may seem. If a catastrophe has an obvious cause, the story tends to stabilize. A ship sinks, a bridge collapses, a fire spreads. People argue about details, but the central narrative remains intact. The mind relaxes, the mystery closes. This disaster never received that luxury. Instead, it occupied a strange space between certainty and uncertainty. People knew something had happened. Nobody doubted that. The evidence surrounded them. The destruction was real. The suffering was real. The dead were real, but understanding remained elusive. And into that uncertainty rushed the oldest force in human communication: rumor. Rumor is fascinating, not because it is dishonest. Most rumors begin honestly. Someone sees something unusual. Someone hears something strange. Someone repeats what they believe to be true. The story travels. The details shift. The emotions remain. Eventually, the story becomes larger than the original observation, like a snowball rolling downhill, growing, collecting, changing shape, yet somehow remaining recognizable. Imagine the hours following the explosion. The city still struggling to comprehend what happened. Communication moving at the speed of conversation. No newspapers arriving instantly. No broadcasts. No photographs. No official explanation available within minutes. Only people. People talking. People guessing. People remembering. People misremembering. And every conversation creating another version of events. A man claims he saw objects flying through the sky. Another insists the earth itself opened. A woman swears she heard thunder before the blast. Someone else says the sky changed color. Another remembers an unusual wind. Each account feels important. Each account contains part of the truth. None contains all of it. And because nobody possesses all of it, every story begins filling its own gaps. This process is not unique to history. It happens today. A major event occurs. Within hours, millions of people begin constructing explanations. Within days, competing narratives emerge. Within weeks, many individuals have chosen the version they prefer. Evidence becomes secondary. Psychology takes over. People do not simply believe what happened. They believe what feels plausible to them, what matches their existing understanding of the world, what confirms things they already suspect. A fearful person sees danger. A religious person sees meaning. A political person sees conspiracy. A scientist sees mechanisms. A storyteller sees narrative. Everyone observes the same event. Everyone leaves with a different version. Now imagine this process unfolding in a world where information moves slowly. A world where eyewitnesses remain the primary technology. A world where rumor is not a flaw in the system. It is the system. Under those conditions, strange ideas flourish. Not because people are foolish, because people are human. And humans have always preferred an explanation over a void. For some, the disaster looked like divine judgment. This was not unusual. Modern audiences sometimes underestimate how naturally earlier societies interpreted catastrophes through spiritual frameworks. If the sky behaved strangely, meaning existed. If disaster struck unexpectedly, meaning existed. If thousands died without warning, meaning almost certainly existed. The universe was expected to communicate. Events were rarely random. A flood meant something. A drought meant something. An eclipse meant something. An explosion powerful enough to devastate part of a city certainly meant something. To many observers, the question was not whether a message existed. The question was what the message meant. This distinction is important because it changes how people investigate. Modern investigators search for causes. Earlier societies often searched for significance. Those are very different missions. One asks what happened, the other asks why it happened, and the answers are rarely the same. Meanwhile, other explanations emerged, more practical, more earthly. Perhaps there had been negligence. Perhaps someone made a mistake. Perhaps explosive materials had been stored improperly. Perhaps a worker ignored a warning. Perhaps officials failed in their duties. These explanations carried their own dangers. Because practical explanations usually imply responsibility, and responsibility creates discomfort. A divine warning may be frightening, but it is difficult to punish a divine warning. Human error is another matter entirely. Human error comes with names, positions, careers, consequences, which means that people with influence often become interested in shaping the story, not necessarily fabricating it, simply guiding it, encouraging certain interpretations, discouraging others. History contains countless examples of this process. A disaster occurs. Then, immediately, a second struggle begins. Not over what happened, over what will be remembered. The two are not always identical. Memory is selective. Institutions are selective. Governments are selective. Individuals are selective. Everyone edits. Everyone simplifies. Everyone constructs narratives. And eventually, one version becomes dominant, not because it is perfect, because it survives. Survival and truth are not interchangeable. Sometimes they overlap. Sometimes they barely know each other. The explosion gradually entered this strange territory. The territory where history begins, transforming into legend. A dangerous place for facts. A wonderful place for stories. And humans have always loved stories, especially stories that resist explanation, especially stories containing impossible details. The missing clothing helped enormously. A city can forget ordinary destruction. A city remembers peculiar destruction. An event can fade. A mystery lingers. People repeated the detail because it felt important, because it felt symbolic, because it felt wrong. Wrong things are memorable. A collapsed wall is unfortunate. 20,000 victims and reports of missing garments feel almost supernatural. The image demands attention, and attention keeps stories alive. Centuries passed. The event remained. Not clearly, not perfectly, but stubbornly, like an object visible beneath muddy water. The outline survived. The details shifted. Some accounts exaggerated. Some simplified. Some contradicted each other. Yet the central mystery endured. What exactly happened? The question remained attractive because it was never fully resolved. Human beings enjoy solving mysteries, but strangely enough, we also enjoy unsolved mysteries. Perhaps even more. A solved puzzle leaves the mind. An unsolved puzzle moves in. It occupies space. It revisits us unexpectedly. It whispers from time to time, maybe this, maybe that, maybe something else entirely. The explosion became one of those puzzles, large enough to matter, strange enough to intrigue, uncertain enough to survive. And survival is ultimately what distinguishes a mystery from a mere question. Most questions disappear once answered. Mysteries endure. They adapt. They travel. They recruit new generations. A person hears the story centuries later and immediately begins participating in the same process. Searching, speculating, imagining, exactly as people did in the aftermath. The technologies change. The psychology remains remarkably familiar, because beneath every theory lies the same uncomfortable reality. People are trying to make sense of something that frightened them, and fear is an exceptionally creative force. Fear can produce caution, wisdom, preparation. It can also produce stories, extraordinary stories. Stories capable of surviving hundreds of years. Stories that become almost impossible to separate from the events that created them. By now, the explosion was no longer just a disaster. It was becoming a mirror. Different people looked into it and saw different things. Divine judgment, human negligence, political failure, cosmic accident, hidden truth, forgotten history. The mystery reflected whatever the observer brought with them, and as time continued passing, the explanations became even stranger. Because once an event survives long enough, it eventually enters the modern world. And the modern world has theories of its own, lots of them. By the time a mystery survives for a few generations, something curious begins to happen. People stop asking what happened. They begin asking what could have happened. At first, that distinction seems small, almost insignificant, but it changes everything. What happened is a question that searches for evidence. What could have happened is a question that invites imagination. And imagination, unlike evidence, has very few limits. The explosion had already travelled through decades of retelling, then through centuries. Witnesses disappeared. Officials disappeared. Entire governments disappeared. Empires came and went. Languages shifted. Cities changed. Buildings were rebuilt. Roads moved. Memories faded. Yet the mystery remained, not because it was perfectly preserved, because it was imperfectly preserved. The gaps helped it survive. People love gaps. Gaps create participation. A complete story is something you receive. An incomplete story is something you join. And so generation after generation found itself staring into the same empty spaces, trying to fill them, trying to explain them, trying to transform uncertainty into certainty. The first explanations were usually the simplest, not necessarily the most accurate, the simplest. Human beings prefer explanations that fit comfortably inside existing beliefs. A person living in a deeply religious world tends to see divine messages. A person living in a scientific age tends to see mechanisms. A person living in an anxious age tends to see conspiracies. Each generation interprets mysteries using whatever tools happen to be available. The mystery itself remains unchanged. The explanations evolve. One possibility involved the sky. The sky is a frequent suspect in historical disasters, partly because things genuinely do fall from it, partly because people spend a great deal of time looking upward when they feel confused. Imagine standing inside a devastated city, buildings damaged, dust filling the air, the source of destruction unclear. Your eyes naturally move upward. You search for answers, clouds, smoke, strange colours, anything unusual. And if enough people do this simultaneously, stories begin forming. Perhaps something came from above. Perhaps a celestial object. Perhaps a fiery stone. Perhaps a sign. Perhaps a warning. Meteor explanations appear surprisingly often throughout history. Sometimes they are correct. Sometimes they are not. The appeal is understandable. A rock arriving from space already sounds extraordinary. Attach it to a mysterious explosion, and suddenly everything feels possible. The problem is that extraordinary explanations require extraordinary evidence, and evidence tends to be stubborn. It either exists or it doesn't. Unfortunately for the meteor theory, evidence remains frustratingly incomplete. Enough uncertainty to keep the idea alive, not enough certainty to settle the matter, which is often the ideal environment for a mystery. Not solved, not disproven, simply lingering. Another explanation focused on wind. This may sound strange initially. Wind feels too ordinary, too familiar, too harmless. Yet some of the most destructive forces on Earth are simply air moving in unusual ways. Tornadoes, cyclones, hurricanes, pressure waves. The atmosphere possesses tremendous power when motivated, and human beings frequently underestimate it. Perhaps because we cannot hold it, cannot see it directly, cannot easily imagine its weight. Yet history contains many examples of air becoming unexpectedly violent. Entire buildings moved, objects carried enormous distances, people displaced, animals transported, debris scattered in seemingly impossible patterns. To witnesses lacking modern meteorological knowledge, such events could appear supernatural. Even today, they sometimes do. The idea of an unusual atmospheric event appealed to certain observers because it seemed to explain some of the stranger reports. The movement, the destruction, the scattered objects, the apparent chaos. But like many theories, it solved some questions while creating others. That is another recurring feature of mysteries. Every explanation functions like a blanket. Pull it over one part of the problem and another part becomes exposed. No theory covers everything, at least not immediately. Then there was the explanation many historians eventually found most practical. The armory itself, the enormous stores of explosive materials, the uncomfortable possibility that the answer had been present from the beginning, not hidden, simply overlooked. This happens more often than people realize. A mystery develops, speculation grows, complex explanations emerge. Then, eventually, someone points toward the obvious. Not because the obvious explanation is boring, because it is usually hiding beneath layers of fascination. Human beings are attracted to extraordinary causes. History frequently prefers ordinary causes with extraordinary consequences. A spark, a mistake, improper storage, a chain reaction, a sequence of events so mundane that people almost find them disappointing. There is something emotionally unsatisfying about discovering that a legendary catastrophe may have begun with a preventable error. We prefer cosmic forces, villains, secrets, hidden technologies, not paperwork, not negligence, not routine failure. Yet routine failure has probably shaped history more than all the villains combined. An overlooked warning, a delayed repair, a minor shortcut, a forgotten inspection. Civilizations accumulate risk, one ordinary decision at a time. Then catastrophe arrives, and everyone searches for a dramatic explanation. The dramatic explanation often arrives later. The ordinary explanation was usually there all along, but centuries passed, and as centuries passed, something else happened. The modern imagination arrived. This changed the mystery entirely. Because modern people possess access to concepts unavailable to earlier generations, industrial explosions, shockwave science, chemical disasters, military technologies, nuclear weapons, and once those ideas enter a mystery, they rarely leave. The internet accelerated this process dramatically. For most of human history, theories travelled slowly. Now they travel at astonishing speed. A person encounters a historical mystery in one country, posts a theory in another. Someone else modifies it. A third person adds speculation. A fourth creates a video. A fifth writes an article. Within weeks, an event centuries old has acquired entirely new explanations. Some thoughtful, some creative, some spectacularly unhelpful. One of the more persistent habits of modern culture is the tendency to attach advanced technology to unresolved mysteries. If an event seems difficult to explain, someone eventually proposes hidden technology. If it seems extremely difficult to explain, someone proposes lost technology. If it seems impossible, someone proposes impossible technology. The progression is remarkably predictable. The explosion attracted exactly this sort of attention. People compared descriptions of the blast to modern weapons, compared reported effects to technologies that would not exist for centuries, compared witness accounts to events the original witnesses could never have imagined. At first glance, such comparisons feel persuasive. Human beings are pattern recognition machines. We notice similarities instinctively. The problem is that similarities are not necessarily connections. A loud blast resembles another loud blast. A shockwave resembles another shockwave. Destruction resembles destruction. The human mind often jumps from resemblance to conclusion with impressive speed. History asks us to slow down, to separate possibility from probability, to distinguish between intriguing and likely. These are not the same thing. Unfortunately, likely explanations rarely go viral. Likely explanations lack glamour. Nobody gathers around a campfire demanding stories about proper storage procedures. People gather around mysteries, around anomalies, around things that seem impossible. And the explosion certainly seemed impossible, at least from a distance. Yet there is another layer beneath all these theories, a deeper layer, a more human layer. The theories themselves tell us something important, not just about the event, about ourselves. Every explanation reveals a fear, a hope, a bias, a worldview. A person who blames heaven reveals one way of understanding chaos. A person who blames officials reveals another. A person who blames hidden technology reveals yet another. The mystery becomes a mirror. Again and again, people believe the explanation that feels emotionally satisfying, not necessarily the explanation most strongly supported by evidence. This tendency is not a flaw unique to earlier centuries. It is alive and well today, perhaps more than ever. We like answers that fit comfortably inside stories we already tell ourselves. History rarely behaves so conveniently. Reality tends to be messier, more complicated, less dramatic, and yet somehow more fascinating. Because the closer we move toward the actual event, the less supernatural it becomes. Not less tragic, not less extraordinary, simply more human. A city, an armory, stored energy, ordinary lives. Sudden destruction, confusion, rumor, memory, time. The ingredients are surprisingly familiar, and perhaps that familiarity is what makes the story unsettling. Because if the disaster resulted from something human rather than something cosmic, then it becomes harder to dismiss, harder to place safely in the category of impossible things, harder to separate from ourselves. The mystery stops belonging to the past. It begins belonging to everyone, and that realization leads us toward another uncomfortable question. Not what happened, not even why it happened, but why so many people eventually stopped talking about it at all. Because some disasters become legends, others become warnings, and some simply fade into the background noise of history, almost as if they were never there. There is a common assumption that important events automatically become part of history. That if something is large enough, tragic enough, or strange enough, it will naturally be remembered. The assumption feels reasonable. It is also wrong. History is not a museum carefully preserving everything that matters. History is much closer to a crowded room where thousands of people are talking at the same time. Some voices carry, most do not. And every year, more voices enter the room. The result is not memory. The result is competition. Every event competes against every other event. Every disaster competes against every war. Every war competes against every revolution. Every revolution competes against every empire. And somewhere in the noise, stories disappear. Not because anyone erased them, because there simply wasn't enough attention to keep them alive. The explosion we have been following suffered from a peculiar problem. It was extraordinary, but it was not alone. The world has always been busy producing new catastrophes. A disaster can dominate conversation for a month. Then a war begins. A king dies. A city falls. A rebellion starts. A famine spreads. and suddenly yesterday's tragedy becomes old news. Human attention is surprisingly short-lived. Even when grief is not. Imagine surviving a catastrophic explosion. Imagine rebuilding your home, searching for relatives, trying to recover from injuries, trying to understand what happened. Now imagine that, while all this is occurring, larger political events begin demanding attention. History does not pause for mourning. It rarely pauses for anything. The next crisis always arrives. Sometimes before the previous one has finished. This reality feels cruel, yet it appears again and again throughout human history. Entire communities experience life-changing disasters. A few years later, the wider world barely remembers. The people who suffered never forget. Everyone else moves on. The explosion existed inside exactly this kind of environment. The period surrounding it was not calm. It was not stable. It was not the sort of era that allows a mystery to sit quietly and receive decades of careful investigation. Political tensions existed. Military concerns existed. Questions of power existed. Questions of legitimacy existed. And whenever those things exist, information becomes complicated, not necessarily false. Complicated, people often imagine censorship as something dramatic, a powerful official locking away documents, a government destroying evidence, a conspiracy unfolding behind closed doors. Sometimes that happens. More often, information disappears through less exciting mechanisms. Neglect, distraction, bureaucracy, loss. A document is copied incorrectly. A report is misplaced. A witness dies. An archive burns. A clerk makes an error. A library closes. A building collapses. A flood arrives. A war begins. And suddenly a piece of the historical record is gone forever. No villain required, just time. Time is one of history's most efficient thieves. It steals patiently, quietly, relentlessly. Most of the people who experienced the explosion left no written account, not because they had nothing to say, because most human beings throughout history never leave written accounts. Their lives survive only indirectly, through tax records, court documents, property records, references in someone else's writing, a brief mention, a name, a number, then silence. This creates an interesting imbalance. The people closest to an event are often the least represented in the historical record. Meanwhile, the people writing about the event may be physically distant from it, socially distant from it, emotionally distant from it. Their accounts survive. The voices of ordinary survivors often do not. Imagine a mother searching for her child after the explosion. Imagine a labourer trying to recover from injuries. Imagine a family rebuilding a damaged home. These people experience the disaster directly, yet their experiences rarely become history, not official history. Official history tends to prefer rulers, officials, generals, policies, large events, large numbers. The everyday human experience often slips through the cracks, which means that many disasters become strangely flattened over time. Thousands of individual tragedies become a single sentence. Thousands of unique experiences become a statistic. A city suffers. A document records the suffering. Centuries later, a historian reads the document. The historian understands the facts. The human reality remains difficult to recover. And then there is another problem: embarrassment. Embarrassment is rarely discussed as a historical force. Perhaps it should be. Governments dislike embarrassment. Institutions dislike embarrassment. Powerful people dislike embarrassment. And large disasters often create it, especially if negligence played a role, especially if warnings were ignored, especially if the catastrophe suggests incompetence. An unexplained explosion is unfortunate. An explosion caused by preventable mistakes is much worse, not only because of the loss of life, because of what it implies. Responsibility, accountability, failure, those are uncomfortable subjects in every era. If explosive materials were involved, difficult questions would naturally follow. Who supervised them? Who inspected them? Who ignored warning signs? Who made decisions? Who failed to make decisions? Questions like these can survive for generations. People often assume history is a search for truth. In many ways, it is. But history is also a search for blame. The two journeys frequently overlap. They are not identical. And when blame enters the conversation, people become selective. Evidence becomes selective. Memory becomes selective. Stories become selective, not necessarily dishonest. Protective. Humans protect themselves. Organizations protect themselves. States protect themselves. The behavior is remarkably consistent. Then there is war. War changes everything. War destroys archives. War redirects attention. War rewrites priorities. War consumes resources. War creates new emergencies that push old emergencies aside. One of the fastest ways for a disaster to vanish from public memory is for a larger disaster to arrive afterward. History contains countless examples. A city burns. Then a war begins. The burning city becomes a footnote. Not because it lacked importance, because something larger occupied the spotlight. The spotlight itself is a limited resource. Only a few events fit inside it at any given moment. Everyone else waits in darkness. Sometimes forever. The explosion eventually found itself in exactly this position, not forgotten entirely, just overshadowed. A victim of historical crowding, a phrase that sounds strange until you realize how often it happens. Imagine a shelf already overflowing with wars, rebellions, political struggles, economic crises, dynastic conflicts, natural disasters, and social upheavals. Now place one more catastrophe onto that shelf. Even an extraordinary catastrophe. Something eventually gets pushed toward the back. This is one reason modern audiences frequently discover historical events they have never heard about. Not because those events were hidden, because attention is finite. Nobody can remember everything. Civilizations make choices. Textbooks make choices. Teachers make choices. Publishers make choices. Documentary filmmakers make choices. Every choice creates memory. Every choice also creates forgetting. Remembering and forgetting are not opposites. They are partners. Every remembered story implies thousands of forgotten ones. This realization can feel unsettling. How many events have disappeared completely? How many mysteries never survived long enough to become mysteries? How many tragedies vanished because nobody copied the document one final time? Nobody knows. And perhaps that uncertainty is part of what makes this explosion so compelling. Against considerable odds, it survived. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough evidence remained. Enough witnesses remained. Enough questions remained. The story endured, like a damaged photograph, missing pieces, blurred edges, faded details, yet still recognizable, still capable of capturing attention centuries later, still capable of making modern listeners pause and ask the same question that survivors once asked. What exactly happened here? That question survived wars, governments, generations, languages, and perhaps that survival tells us something important, because most events do not survive. Most events disappear quietly. This one did not. Somehow, despite everything, the mystery remained alive. And the longer it remained alive, the more another problem began emerging. A problem that affects nearly every historical catastrophe. The problem of storytelling itself. Because once enough time passes, people stop encountering the event directly. They encounter versions of the event, retellings, interpretations, summaries, adaptations, and that is where history becomes something even stranger. Not just memory, but narrative. There is a comforting idea that many people carry around without realizing it. The idea goes something like this. An event happens. People observe it. The facts are recorded. History preserves those facts. Future generations learn what happened. Simple, clean, reliable. The problem is that almost none of it works that way. Not today. Certainly not centuries ago, because between an event and its eventual place in history stands a long chain of human beings. And human beings are wonderfully complicated creatures. They misunderstand things, forget things, exaggerate things, simplify things, improve stories, shorten stories, lengthen stories, leave things out, add things in, and most of the time they do all of this without realizing it. The explosion had already become a mystery. Now it faced another challenge: translation, not merely between languages, between people. Because every time a story passes from one person to another, a translation occurs. Even when both people speak the same language, one person experiences, another person listens. The listener imagines. The imagination fills gaps. The new version travels onward. The process repeats, again and again and again. Imagine standing in the damaged city only hours after the blast. You have survived. Barely. Someone asks, what happened? What do you say? The obvious answer is that you describe what you saw. But what did you actually see? That question is more difficult than it sounds, because nobody observes a catastrophe in its entirety. Everyone receives fragments: a sound, a shockwave, a collapsing wall, a cloud of dust, a crowd running, a missing relative. The human brain assembles these fragments into a coherent narrative later, often much later, sometimes incorrectly. This is not dishonesty. It is memory doing its best. Memory is less like a recording device and more like a storyteller. It values meaning over precision. A witness may genuinely believe every word they are saying. That does not guarantee every word is true. One of the strangest discoveries in modern psychology is how confident people can be about memories that are partially wrong. Not completely wrong. That would be easier. Partially wrong. The dangerous kind of wrong. The kind mixed with truth. The kind that sounds convincing because most of it happened. Disasters create perfect conditions for this. Fear sharpens certain memories, blurs others. A person remembers the sound perfectly, forgets the timing, remembers the terror, misjudges the distance, remembers running, misremembers direction. Then years pass. The memory changes slightly. Then decades. Then generations. Eventually somebody writes it down, and now the memory has become history, at least temporarily. The explosion produced countless opportunities for this process. Consider the famous reports regarding clothing. Perhaps a witness saw several victims without garments. A shocking image, certainly memorable. The witness repeats the story. Another person hears it, retells it. The next person remembers it slightly differently. Soon the detail begins growing, not because anyone intended deception, because dramatic details attract attention. Attention helps stories survive. A story about missing clothing travels farther than a story about damaged masonry. Human beings have always preferred unusual details, and unusual details have always known it. Imagine two stories competing for survival. The first says that many buildings suffered structural damage. The second says that bodies were found without clothing after a mysterious explosion. Which story gets repeated? Which story gets remembered? Which story survives 200 years? The answer is obvious. The unusual detail wins. It almost always wins. This creates an interesting distortion. History often preserves the most memorable aspects of an event rather than the most representative ones. The result is a kind of magnification. Certain details become enormous, others shrink. Eventually, the audience remembers the symbol rather than the reality. The explosion becomes the story about missing clothes, not the story about urban vulnerability, not the story about stored explosives, not the story about infrastructure. The symbol takes over. Symbols are efficient. Reality is not. Reality contains too many details, too many contradictions, too many boring parts. Stories streamline. Reality resists streamlining. This tension has existed for as long as humans have told stories. The challenge becomes even greater when official records enter the picture. People often imagine official records as objective. Some are. Many try to be. Yet, official records are still created by human beings. Human beings working under pressure. Human beings with incomplete information. Human beings trying to satisfy superiors. Human beings attempting to create order from chaos. An official report may be more accurate than a rumor. That does not make it perfect. A government investigating a disaster faces impossible questions. How many people died? What caused the event? Who bears responsibility? What evidence remains? Which witnesses are reliable? What should be communicated publicly? Each answer requires judgment. Judgment introduces interpretation. Interpretation introduces variation. Variation introduces competing narratives. And suddenly, there is not one story. There are several. The witness version, the government version, the religious version, the local version, the outsider version, the version told immediately, the version told years later, the version translated into another language, the version simplified for future readers, the version adapted into popular culture, the version shared online centuries later. Every version resembles the original. None is identical. If that sounds frustrating, it should, because historians spend enormous amounts of time wrestling with exactly this problem. Not finding information, evaluating information. There is a difference. Finding information is often easier. Understanding which information deserves trust is harder. A witness says one thing, an official says another. A later chronicler says something else entirely. Who should we believe? The answer is usually unsatisfying. Perhaps all of them, perhaps none of them, perhaps pieces of each. Historical truth often resembles a mosaic. Thousands of broken fragments assembled into an image. No fragment reveals the whole picture. The picture emerges only when enough fragments are placed together. And even then, some sections remain missing. This is why certainty becomes dangerous, especially around famous mysteries. People want definitive answers. History frequently offers probabilities instead, not because historians are indecisive, because reality is. The explosion sits inside exactly this kind of uncertainty. There are enough records to know something catastrophic happened, enough records to know many people died, enough records to know the event shocked contemporaries, enough records to know strange details survived, but not enough to eliminate every question, not enough to silence every theory, not enough to stop new interpretations from appearing, and every new interpretation creates another version of the story. The modern world has accelerated this process dramatically. In earlier centuries, a story might evolve over generations. Now it evolves over hours. An article appears, a video appears, a podcast appears, a discussion begins. Someone adds context. Someone removes context. Someone simplifies. Someone sensationalizes. Someone misunderstands. Someone corrects. Someone misquotes the correction. The cycle continues. Information multiplies. Clarity does not always increase. In fact, sometimes the opposite occurs. Too much information can be almost as confusing as too little. 100 competing explanations create their own form of uncertainty. The listener becomes overwhelmed. The audience begins choosing the version that feels most satisfying, not necessarily the version supported by the strongest evidence, the version that tells the best story. And this brings us back to something we encountered earlier. Perhaps the greatest challenge facing historical truth is not deception, it is competition. Thousands of stories competing for attention, thousands of explanations competing for belief, thousands of narratives competing for survival. The explosion survived because it became a powerful story. The mystery survived because no single explanation completely defeated the others. And somewhere beneath all those competing versions, beneath centuries of retelling and reinterpretation, the original event still waits, quietly, patiently, like an object buried beneath layers of dust, not invisible, not fully visible either, just enough exposed to remind us that something real happened here, something terrible, something confusing, something human. And if we want to move any closer to the truth, we must leave stories behind for a moment and return to the people who experienced it. Because before there were rumors, before there were records, before there were theories, there were witnesses, and witnesses carry their own mysteries. There is a curious contradiction at the heart of every historical disaster. The people closest to the event are often the people who understand it least. That sounds unfair, perhaps even insulting. After all, they were there, they saw it, they lived through it. Who could possibly know more than the witnesses? And yet history repeatedly teaches the same lesson. Experiencing something is not the same as understanding it. In fact, sometimes experience makes understanding more difficult, especially when fear enters the equation, especially when events unfold faster than the human brain was designed to process. Imagine, for a moment, that you are standing in the city, not reading about it, not watching it, standing there. The morning feels ordinary. You are thinking about something small, something personal, something completely unrelated to catastrophe. Maybe you are worried about money. Maybe you are thinking about lunch. Maybe you are annoyed with a neighbor. Maybe you are replaying a conversation from yesterday. The mind spends most of its time in small places. Then the explosion happens. Or perhaps more accurately, the world changes. Instantly, violently, without permission. What happens next inside the human brain is fascinating and deeply inconvenient for historians, because the brain was not designed to create accurate records. It was designed to keep you alive. Those are very different objectives. When danger appears, the brain immediately begins making decisions about what deserves attention. Some information becomes incredibly vivid. Other information disappears entirely. A person may remember a sound for the rest of their life, yet forget what happened 5 seconds earlier. Another person may remember a face, a color, a smell, a single sentence. Everything else vanishes. Memory under stress behaves less like a camera and more like a flashlight. It illuminates certain details intensely while leaving everything else in darkness. This is one reason witness accounts often seem contradictory. Not because witnesses are lying, because they are describing different flashlights, different fragments, different moments. One survivor remembers dust, another remembers silence, a third remembers noise. All may be correct, even if their accounts appear inconsistent. Catastrophe does not distribute experience equally. A person 50 feet away may inhabit an entirely different reality from someone standing a block away. This creates a challenge. Later generations often imagine disasters as single events. But disasters are really thousands of events occurring simultaneously, thousands of perspectives, thousands of private experiences, thousands of separate worlds colliding for a few terrible moments. The explosion at the center of our story created exactly this kind of confusion. Some witnesses described a tremendous roar. Others focused on the movement of air. Others remembered darkness. Others remembered flying debris. Some recalled people running. Some recalled people freezing. Some remembered nothing at all. That final category is surprisingly common. The brain occasionally responds to overwhelming events by refusing to create a complete memory, not out of weakness, out of protection. Trauma has a strange relationship with time. Minutes feel like seconds. Seconds feel like minutes. Events become rearranged. Cause and effect become blurred. People remember outcomes more clearly than sequences. A person may vividly remember finding themselves on the ground, yet have no memory of falling. A person may remember the aftermath, yet not the moment itself. The missing moments do not necessarily indicate deception. They indicate humanity. This becomes especially important when we consider the most famous details associated with the explosion. The details that survived. The details that became legends, because legends rarely emerge from ordinary observations. They emerge from emotionally powerful ones, and emotion leaves fingerprints all over memory. Imagine encountering something genuinely shocking, something you have never seen before, something that feels impossible. Your brain immediately assigns significance to it. The unusual detail becomes a landmark, a reference point, a mental anchor. Everything else begins organizing itself around that anchor. The missing clothing may have functioned this way, not because it was necessarily the most important detail, because it was the most emotionally disturbing detail. People remember things that violate expectations. A damaged building is tragic, yet understandable. An injured person is tragic, yet understandable. Reports of bodies without clothing after a mysterious explosion feel different. The detail refuses to behave. It demands attention, and attention is the first step toward memory. Consider how often people remember unusual details from ordinary days. A strange conversation, an unusual animal, a misplaced object. The detail survives because it interrupts expectation. Now imagine that process amplified by catastrophe. The emotional intensity increases dramatically. The unusual detail becomes unforgettable. Years later, a witness may forget countless smaller observations. The shocking image remains, not because it was objectively more important, because the brain treated it as more important. This distinction matters, because history is built from memories, and memories are built from attention, which means that some details naturally become larger over time, not through dishonesty, through repetition. A witness shares a story. The listener reacts strongly. The witness notices. The detail receives emphasis during future retellings. The process continues. Eventually, the memory itself may shift, not dramatically, subtly, the way a path becomes more visible every time someone walks it. Modern psychology has revealed something deeply unsettling about memory. Every act of remembering slightly changes the memory itself. We tend to imagine memories as stored objects, like books on shelves. The truth is stranger. Memory is reconstruction. Every recollection involves rebuilding the experience, and every rebuilding introduces tiny opportunities for change. Most changes are harmless. Some become significant. Multiply that process over decades, then centuries, then generations. The implications become obvious. The witnesses who survived the explosion were not preserving a fixed photograph. They were carrying living memories. Living things change. Stories change. Meaning changes. The event remains. The interpretation evolves. This does not make witness testimony useless. Far from it. Witnesses remain among the most valuable sources available. but witness testimony must be understood for what it is: human, beautifully human, imperfectly human, emotionally human. A witness does not provide reality itself. A witness provides reality as experienced through a particular mind at a particular moment, and that perspective contains both insight and limitation. The challenge for historians is not choosing between witnesses and evidence. It is combining them, allowing physical evidence to inform memory, allowing memory to give meaning to physical evidence. One without the other leaves us incomplete. Physical evidence tells us what happened. Human testimony tells us what it felt like, and what it felt like matters, perhaps more than we sometimes admit. Because disasters are not merely mechanical events, they are emotional events, social events, psychological events. A city does not simply suffer damage. A city experiences fear, confusion, disorientation, loss. The explosion transformed buildings, but it also transformed minds. Thousands of people carried that transformation for the rest of their lives. Even if history preserved only fragments of it, even if their names disappeared, even if their voices faded, the emotional reality remained, lingering quietly beneath every account, every rumor, every theory, every retelling, and perhaps that is why the mystery survived. Not because the physical event was impossible to explain, because the human experience was impossible to forget. Centuries later, we still find ourselves drawn toward it, still listening to echoes, still searching through fragments, still trying to understand a morning that changed into something else, something larger, something stranger, something that left behind more than destruction. It left behind questions, and questions, unlike buildings, are surprisingly difficult to destroy. But if we truly want to move closer to an answer, we need something more stable than memory, something less emotional, something that does not care about fear, rumor, politics, or storytelling. We need evidence, and that means following the paper trail that survived. Because while witnesses remember, archives endure, at least for a while. If eyewitnesses give us emotion, archives give us distance. Neither is perfect, neither is complete, but together they allow us to approach something that resembles understanding, not certainty. History rarely offers certainty. Understanding, and understanding is often enough. There is something oddly comforting about archives, even if you have never entered one. Even if you have never handled a centuries-old document, the idea itself feels reassuring. A room somewhere, quiet, dusty, shelves stretching into darkness, boxes filled with records, letters, reports, inventories, official notices, forgotten paperwork. Human beings have always trusted paperwork more than they probably should, perhaps because paper appears calm. A witness may be frightened. A rumor may be distorted. A document simply sits there, patiently, waiting. It creates the impression of reliability, and often that impression is deserved. But documents have their own limitations. A document records what someone chose to write, not everything that happened. That distinction matters enormously. Imagine trying to reconstruct your own day using only receipts: a coffee purchase, a grocery transaction, a parking ticket. The records would be accurate. Yet the most important parts of your day might be missing entirely. The conversation that changed your mood, the thought that stayed with you, the moment you laughed, the moment you worried. Documents preserve reality unevenly. Archives do the same. The explosion left behind exactly this kind of uneven record. Enough survived to confirm that something extraordinary occurred. Enough survived to confirm widespread destruction. Enough survived to confirm significant loss of life. Enough survived to preserve the mystery, but not enough to eliminate uncertainty. And that combination may be the most frustrating category in all of history. Too much evidence to dismiss, too little evidence to conclude. The result is an endless invitation to investigate. Imagine an archivist, centuries later, opening a document connected to the disaster. Perhaps a report, perhaps an official account, perhaps a summary prepared for authorities. The document contains information, names, numbers, descriptions, observations. Yet every answer immediately generates new questions. Where did the number come from? Who recorded it? How soon after the event? Based on what evidence? Were they present? Were they repeating someone else's account? Was there political pressure? Were details omitted, added, misunderstood? One of the strange realities of historical research is that every document functions simultaneously as evidence and as a mystery. The paper speaks. The paper also demands interrogation. Historians become detectives not because they enjoy suspicion, because suspicion is necessary. A document claiming 20,000 deaths sounds important, but how was that figure produced? A report describing unusual effects sounds valuable, but who observed those effects? The archive rarely volunteers these answers. They must be extracted patiently, slowly, carefully, like fragments of pottery emerging from soil. This process can feel disappointing to people seeking dramatic revelations. Real historical investigation is often less like solving a murder mystery and more like assembling a puzzle after half the pieces have been lost. The surviving pieces matter enormously. The missing pieces matter even more, because the missing pieces define the limits of certainty. The explosion exists inside those limits. Researchers examining the event eventually encounter several stubborn facts. A major catastrophe occurred. The destruction was extensive. The effects shocked contemporaries. The event centered around an area associated with explosive materials. Those facts appear repeatedly. Different documents, different accounts, different periods, different observers. When independent pieces of evidence continue pointing in the same direction, confidence increases, not certainty. Confidence. There is a difference. History rarely moves beyond confidence. The public often wants verdicts. Historians usually work with probabilities. This can feel unsatisfying. Yet, probabilities often represent the most honest answer available. Imagine a courtroom where most witnesses have been dead for centuries. Most physical evidence has disappeared. The crime scene has been rebuilt. The surrounding city has changed. The surviving documents disagree in places. That is, essentially, the environment historians inhabit. Every conclusion must acknowledge uncertainty. The alternative is storytelling disguised as certainty. And certainty is surprisingly dangerous, especially around mysteries. The archives also reveal another important detail. Human beings love recording unusual things. This tendency stretches across cultures and centuries. If something appears strange, people write about it. If something appears impossible, they write about it repeatedly. The missing clothing reports survived partly because they felt extraordinary. They stood out. They interrupted expectation. A chronicler recording a routine collapse may use a sentence. A chronicler recording something bizarre may devote an entire paragraph. Attention leaves traces in archives. The more emotionally striking a detail becomes, the more likely it is to survive. This creates a challenge historians know well. The surviving record often overrepresents the unusual, not because the unusual dominated reality, because it dominated attention. Imagine documenting a city after disaster. Thousands of ordinary tragedies occur. Then one genuinely strange observation appears. Which one receives emphasis? Human nature answers immediately. The strange observation, the memorable observation, the observation likely to be repeated. Centuries later, researchers inherit that imbalance. They must distinguish between what happened and what attracted attention. The two overlap. They are not identical. This brings us back to the central mystery. The explosion, the clothing, the death toll, the rumours, the theories. What happens when we examine all these pieces together? The answer is surprisingly revealing, because when the emotional layers begin falling away, a pattern emerges. Not a dramatic pattern, not a supernatural pattern, a human pattern, a familiar pattern, stored energy, dense population, limited safety procedures, incomplete understanding of risk, sudden failure, mass confusion, information loss, rumour formation, historical distortion. The sequence appears again and again throughout history. Different countries, different centuries, different technologies. The details change. The structure remains remarkably similar. This is one reason the event feels both unique and familiar. Unique in its particulars, familiar in its humanity. The archives slowly guide us toward this realization, not through one decisive revelation, through accumulation, a report here, a record there, a reference elsewhere. Individually, each piece feels insufficient. Together, they begin forming a picture. The picture remains incomplete, yet increasingly recognizable, like a face emerging through fog, not sharp enough to identify every feature, sharp enough to understand the general shape. And perhaps that is the most we can reasonably expect from history. Not perfect reconstruction, reasonable reconstruction. History rarely restores the past. It approximates it. The explosion survives within that approximation. A real event, observed by real people. Remembered imperfectly, recorded imperfectly, transmitted imperfectly, yet somehow still visible, still present, still capable of demanding our attention centuries later. That persistence is remarkable, because most events vanish, most questions disappear, most paperwork ends up forgotten. This mystery endured, not because the archive was complete, because it was incomplete in exactly the right way. Enough evidence to prove something extraordinary happened. Enough uncertainty to keep asking why. And now, after following witnesses, rumours, records, theories, and centuries of retelling, we find ourselves approaching the question that has been waiting quietly in the background all along. Not what people believed, not what people feared, not what people imagined, but what most likely happened. And sometimes, after a long journey through mystery, the most plausible answer turns out to be both less dramatic and more unsettling than anyone expected. There is a tendency to believe that history operates according to merit, that the most important events become the most remembered, that the largest tragedies receive the most attention, that the greatest losses leave the deepest marks. It is a comforting belief. It suggests fairness. It suggests order. It suggests that memory functions like a careful librarian, preserving significance and discarding trivia. But history is not a careful librarian. History is much closer to a crowded shoreline. Waves arrive. Footprints appear. Footprints disappear. Some remain longer than others. Few remain forever. And often the footprints that survive are not the ones you would expect. The explosion we have been following presents a fascinating example of this problem. Thousands may have died. An entire district was devastated. Witnesses describe scenes so unusual that centuries later people still debate them. Yet ask the average person about history's great disasters, and this event rarely appears. Not near the top. Sometimes not at all. Why? The question seems simple. The answer is not. Because remembrance has surprisingly little to do with importance. Remembrance has much more to do with storytelling. Human beings remember stories, not events. Events become memorable only after they acquire stories strong enough to carry them across generations. And some events never receive that story. Imagine two catastrophes of equal scale. One receives photographs, the other does not. One produces famous survivors, the other does not. One becomes politically useful, the other does not. One enters schools, the other remains buried in archives. A century later, their public visibility may look completely different. Not because one mattered more, because one travelled more effectively through culture. Culture behaves like a river. Some stories float, some sink. The explosion occupied an awkward position, too old for photography, too distant for living memory, too complicated for simple explanation, too uncertain for easy teaching, too strange for straightforward history, too historical for modern news, too mysterious for conventional textbooks. It existed in a kind of no man's land between categories, and events that fit neatly into categories usually survive better than events that do not. People enjoy clear narratives, heroes, villains, causes, consequences, lessons, beginnings, endings. This disaster resisted such neat organization. It did not offer a single villain. It did not offer a universally accepted cause. It did not conclude with a satisfying lesson. Instead, it left questions. Questions are powerful, but they are difficult to teach. A teacher can explain a battle. A teacher can explain a revolution. A teacher can explain a law. Explaining uncertainty is harder, especially within limited time, and so uncertain stories often move toward the edges of collective memory. Not because they lack value, because they require patience. Modern culture is not always famous for patience. There is another reason some catastrophes disappear: scale itself. Oddly enough, very large numbers can sometimes reduce emotional impact rather than increase it. A single story captures attention. 10,000 stories become abstract. A photograph of one person often affects people more deeply than statistics describing entire populations. This has always been true. The human mind evolved to understand individuals, not enormous populations. A grieving mother, a frightened child, a wounded labourer. These feel real. 20,000 casualties feel distant, not because 20,000 is unimportant, because it exceeds our emotional bandwidth. Numbers grow. Empathy struggles to keep pace. The explosion became trapped inside this paradox. Too many victims to understand individually. Too few surviving personal accounts to humanize collectively. The result was a strange imbalance. A large tragedy without enough individual stories. And individual stories are the engines of memory. Without them, even major disasters begin fading. Imagine a city rebuilding after catastrophe. The survivors continue living. Children grow up. New buildings appear. Markets reopen. Life resumes. This process feels hopeful. It is also one of history's most efficient erasers. Recovery gradually hides evidence, not intentionally. Naturally, a ruined building becomes a repaired building, then a replacement building, then a memory, then perhaps not even a memory. A generation passes. Another generation follows. People born afterward experience a different city. Their relationship to the disaster changes. For survivors, the catastrophe remains immediate. For their children, it becomes family history. For grandchildren, it becomes a story. For later generations, it becomes an interesting fact. Eventually, it becomes a footnote. And sometimes even the footnote disappears. The process feels almost unfair. A moment that defined thousands of lives slowly loses its emotional weight. Not because people stop caring, because people are busy surviving their own lives. Every generation inherits old tragedies while simultaneously creating new ones. Attention stretches only so far. This may be one of the saddest truths in history. Forgetting is not usually an act of cruelty. It is often an act of limitation. Human beings cannot carry everything. Civilizations cannot remember everything. Even libraries cannot preserve everything. Choices must be made. Those choices create memory. They also create absence. Sometimes the absence becomes so large that later generations mistake it for emptiness. But absence is not emptiness. Absence is often evidence that something once occupied the space. The explosion left exactly that kind of absence. A shape in memory, a gap, a shadow, not completely forgotten, not fully remembered, existing somewhere in between. There is something strangely moving about events that occupy this middle ground. They feel fragile, as though they survive only because a few people continue asking questions. A historian reads a document. An archivist preserves a record. A writer becomes curious. A listener stays awake late at night, wondering what happened. The chain continues. Memory survives, barely. History often depends upon these small acts of attention, far more than people realize. A catastrophe does not remain remembered automatically. Someone must keep looking. Someone must keep asking. Someone must keep telling the story. Otherwise, silence gradually takes over. And silence is patient, very patient. Longer lived than any empire. Longer lived than any government. Longer lived than most monuments. Eventually, silence receives almost everything, which makes the survival of any historical mystery feel remarkable. The explosion could have vanished completely. Many events did. Many larger events did. Many equally tragic events did. Yet this one remained, damaged, fragmented, blurred, but present, like a faint voice continuing to echo long after the speaker has disappeared. And perhaps that persistence tells us something important. Not just about the explosion, about memory itself. Because remembrance is not always a reward for importance. Sometimes remembrance is simply the result of chance, a surviving document, a preserved archive, a copied manuscript, a curious reader, a fortunate accident. History often feels deliberate. In reality, it can be surprisingly fragile. A single lost record may change everything. A single surviving record may save an entire story. Which brings us to the final stage of our journey. After witnesses, after rumors, after theories, after archives, after centuries of remembering and forgetting, we are finally close enough to attempt something historians rarely enjoy doing, drawing a conclusion, not a perfect conclusion, not a final conclusion, just the most reasonable conclusion available. Because while certainty remains out of reach, the evidence has been quietly pointing in a particular direction all along. And the closer we look, the more the mystery begins transforming, not into something supernatural, not into something impossible, into something profoundly human. After all the stories, all the rumors, all the theories, all the arguments, and all the centuries of uncertainty, we eventually arrive at a place that feels strangely quiet. The mystery has not disappeared, but it has changed. At the beginning of our journey, the explosion seemed almost supernatural, an event so strange that it appeared to exist outside ordinary experience. 20,000 dead, bodies reportedly found without clothing, a city transformed in moments, a catastrophe slipping through the cracks of history. The ingredients felt almost designed to create legends. And legends, once formed, tend to grow. They accumulate mystery. They attract speculation. They gather strange explanations the way old ships gather barnacles. Eventually, it becomes difficult to separate the original structure from everything attached afterward. So let us do something simple. Let us remove the layers, slowly, patiently, and see what remains. Imagine the city, once again, not as a mystery, not as a legend, as a real place, filled with real people, a living city, a working city, a city containing all the ordinary activities that occupy human life. Markets, families, labourers, officials, children, merchants, arguments, meals, bills, repairs, dreams. The kinds of things that never appear in history books because they happen every day. Now place something dangerous inside that city. Not mysterious, dangerous. A large concentration of explosive material, stored energy waiting patiently. The kind of danger that often appears harmless precisely because it remains quiet. Days pass, weeks pass, months pass, perhaps years pass. Nothing happens. People become comfortable. Familiarity settles in. Routine develops. The danger becomes part of the background, a permanent feature, no longer frightening because it is no longer noticed. Human beings have always possessed this talent. We adapt to risk, sometimes wisely, sometimes disastrously. At some point, a chain of events begins. Perhaps a spark, perhaps negligence, perhaps an accident, perhaps a sequence nobody fully understood at the time. The exact trigger may never be known. History occasionally keeps its secrets. What matters is not the first step. What matters is the outcome. Energy that had remained contained suddenly ceases to remain contained. Pressure builds, then releases. The explosion occurs, not as magic, not as a mystery, as physics, violent, unforgiving, indifferent physics. The resulting destruction is immense. Buildings collapse. Debris flies. People are injured. People are killed. The city suffers. The immediate aftermath becomes chaotic. Confusion spreads faster than information. Witnesses struggle to understand what happened. Families search for one another. Officials attempt to gather reports. Rumors begin forming. Every element we have discussed emerges naturally from this environment. No supernatural explanation required. No hidden technology required. No lost civilization required. Just human beings encountering an event far larger than their ability to process immediately. The famous reports involving clothing begin making more sense when viewed through this lens. Not necessarily because every account was perfectly accurate, not necessarily because every retelling preserved the details correctly, but because catastrophic explosions can produce strange scenes, violent pressure, flying debris, structural collapse, rescue efforts, body movement, clothing displacement. The aftermath of large-scale destruction rarely resembles ordinary experience. People witnessing extraordinary scenes describe them using extraordinary language. The reports survive. The reports evolve. The mystery grows. And then comes the number, 20,000, perhaps more, perhaps less. The exact figure remains uncertain, yet uncertainty does not eliminate tragedy. Whether the true number was 15,000, 20,000, or some other figure entirely, the scale remains horrifying. A city lost an enormous number of people. Families vanished. Neighborhoods changed forever. Lives ended abruptly. The difference between one large number and another large number matters historically. It changes very little emotionally. The suffering remains. Then another process begins. The one we spent so much time exploring, memory. The disaster enters human consciousness. Witnesses tell stories. Officials write reports. Chroniclers record observations. Later generations inherit fragments. The fragments travel through time. Some become distorted. Some remain surprisingly accurate. Most become a mixture of both. This is where many mysteries are born, not because the original event was unknowable, because human memory and human storytelling interact in complicated ways. The explosion did not need supernatural elements. Time supplied them, not intentionally. Naturally, every generation added interpretation. Questions accumulated, answers shifted. The event gradually transformed from catastrophe into mystery, then from mystery into legend, and finally from legend into something else entirely. A mirror. A mirror reflecting the concerns of whoever happened to be looking. Earlier observers saw divine warnings. Later observers saw political failure. Modern observers sometimes see conspiracies. Others see technological mysteries. The event changes shape because people change shape. The explosion remains. The interpretations evolve. There is something oddly comforting about this realization. Not because it solves everything, because it returns the story to human scale. The catastrophe was terrible, but it was not incomprehensible. The people who experienced it were confused, but they were not irrational. The witnesses were imperfect, but they were not dishonest. The archives were incomplete, but they were not useless. Every piece contributes something. Every fragment matters. And when enough fragments accumulate, a picture begins emerging. Not perfectly. History rarely offers perfect pictures, but clearly enough to understand the broad outlines, clearly enough to recognize familiar patterns, stored danger, human vulnerability, sudden catastrophe, information loss, rumor formation, historical distortion, collective forgetting. The pattern appears repeatedly across centuries. Different technologies, different governments, different cities. The same underlying human story. And perhaps that is the most unsettling conclusion of all, because it means the mystery does not belong exclusively to the past. The specific explosion belongs to the past. The pattern does not. Every generation believes it understands risk better than previous generations. Every generation identifies the mistakes of earlier societies. Every generation feels slightly wiser, slightly safer, slightly more informed. History listens politely. Then history points toward another disaster, and another, and another. Not because people fail to learn, because people are human. We normalize danger. We ignore warnings. We trust routine. We assume tomorrow will resemble today. Most of the time, we are correct. Occasionally, we are not. The city at the center of this story learned that lesson in the most painful way imaginable. One ordinary morning, one extraordinary moment, centuries of questions afterward. And perhaps that is why the story still matters. Not because it proves something supernatural happened, not because it hides a secret technology, not because it reveals a conspiracy buried beneath history. It matters because it reveals something very ordinary and very uncomfortable. Human beings are fragile. Cities are fragile. Memory is fragile. Certainty is fragile. The things that feel permanent often are not. A building stands for decades, then vanishes. A neighborhood thrives, then changes. A document survives centuries, then disappears. A story is almost forgotten, then suddenly remembered again. Everything moves, everything changes, everything drifts. Even history, especially history. And as we sit here now, separated from that morning by centuries, there is something strangely moving about the fact that we can still hear the faint echo of it. Not the explosion itself. That sound vanished long ago. What remains is the question. The question survived. The question crossed generations. The question outlived witnesses, governments, cities, and assumptions. And perhaps questions are sometimes more durable than answers, because answers settle. Questions travel. They move quietly through time, waiting for another curious person, another late evening, another moment of wonder, another listener willing to pause and ask what really happened. Tonight, We followed one of those questions as far as the surviving evidence allows. Not to certainty, but close enough to glimpse something real, close enough to see the outlines of a tragedy hidden beneath a legend, close enough to understand that history is rarely about perfect answers. It is about patient listening, listening to witnesses, listening to archives, listening to silences, listening to the spaces where certainty used to be. And sometimes, if we listen carefully enough, the past answers. Not completely, but enough. Enough to remind us that behind every mystery, there were once ordinary people living ordinary lives. People who expected tomorrow. People who never imagined they would become part of history. People who vanished. And people who were remembered, at least for a little while. And perhaps, for tonight, that is enough.